Today we're here to talk about one of the most iconic and one of the most insane vehicles on sale in North America, the BMW M5. For 2018, we get an all-new M5 that has caused a little bit of a stir in the M community, because under the hood, we find an automatic transmission, and for the first time ever in a BMW M sedan, all-wheel drive. But personally, I think that these two things together make this the best M5 ever built, and this is one of the reasons that I've liked the newer generation of M sedans more than previous generations, because this is the ultimate in absolutely insane performance in a very livable form. This is a four-door family sedan. We have 5 seats in the back. We have room for child seats, but this will go 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. The M5 was capable of quarter-mile times that will make supercars jealous, not just 5 years ago, but today. BMW's M cars have always been about stealth, and that's true for this generation as well. This looks very much like a BMW 5 Series up front. We have the same sort of grille going on, LED headlamps. We have no fog lamps below because we need the extra cooling for that massive engine under the hood, well-integrated front parking sensors. And even though there is a little bit of a different lip at the bottom, everything is done in a restrained and reserved fashion. From the side profile, the M5 is almost indistinguishable from the regular 5 Series model, because even though there are significant body changes in order to make the 5 Series into the M5, they're integrated very well, and they're definitely designed in a way that they don't really stick out and scream, here's an M5. So we get these fender bulges up front and in the back, but they're very well done, tastefully integrated, not tacked on like we find in some cars out there. We have M-specific 20-inch wheels, but they're not too crazy, not 21s or 22s or anything like that. A subtle M5 badge right there on the side. Some different side view mirrors, pretty typical in an M vehicle. But other than that, and a very, very discreet spoiler on the trunk lid, it looks just like a regular 5 Series. As you'd expect from a performance variant, we get some tweaks out back, but again, discreet is the name of the game here. So even though we have quad exhaust tips at the bottom, they're not absolutely enormous. Even though we get some air diffusion going on right down there at the bottom of the bumper, it's not quite Subaru WRX STI, and again we have that very subtle spoiler right there on top of the trunk. This is designed to be the kind of vehicle that an executive or a CEO or the president of a company, something along those lines, would be able to drive every day to work, take clients out to lunch in, and not have it feel sort of like a boy racer vehicle, but then go absolutely insanely fast whenever they want to. Under this hood, we find an engine that is more than twice as powerful as the average 5 Series in the world. But before we talk about that, let's start at the beginning. Lesser 5 Series models make do with a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine or a 3-liter 6-cylinder engine that produces either 248 horsepower or 335 horsepower. Then, because BMW is slicing their performance letter a little bit more thinly these days, we get the first sort of M, the BMW M550i. Under that hood, you'll find a twin-turbo V8 engine producing 456 horsepower. That's mated to an 8-speed automatic transmission and standard all-wheel drive. But the M550i isn't a full-on M like the M5, so even though it does get a different engine, it doesn't get all the same kind of tweaks that you'd expect out of a full-on M vehicle. So no carbon ceramic brakes, no significant body changes, etc. That's where this vehicle, the full-on M, comes in. It uses a variant of that same engine, but it has been significantly reworked in order to create 600 horsepower or 617 horsepower if you get the competition pack for 2019. Both versions produce the same amount of torque, 553. Unlike previous generations of the M5, the transmission is a standard 8-speed ZF automatic transmission. Basically the same sort of transmission that we find under the hood of the M550i. A lot of M purists have been really upset by this transition, and I was recently at an event in Portland with a number of other performance cars and other journalists, and half of them were really upset that the M car isn't a real M car according to them. It doesn't have a manual transmission, it doesn't have a dual clutch transmission, it has turbocharged engines under the hood, not naturally aspirated engines, and it's not rear-wheel drive. Personally, I don't think any of those things actually matter, because if BMW was to compete with the rest of the insane super sedans in the world, all of this was necessary. But a little bit more than that, I actually think that this makes sense in terms of the personality of high-performance sedans like this. The automatic transmission is significantly smoother than a dual-clutch transmission. This is also significantly smoother than the transmission that you'll find in the Mercedes-Benz E-Class AMG. That transmission is really, really rough at lower speeds, especially stop-and-go traffic, and we don't find that in a traditional automatic. The all-wheel drive system under this hood is also kind of unique because you can actually turn off the front axle completely and have a rear-wheel drive car if you want to do burnouts or if you just want to spin into a tree. But if you're a rational human being, you really want to have the all-wheel drive system on. So when you walk next to an M5 and you see this pattern on the roof, it doesn't mean that this is some sort of accessory or some sort of sticker stuck onto the top. This is actually a carbon fiber reinforced plastic roof. It's stronger than steel and it's also lighter than steel, and that helps reduce not only the curb weight of the vehicle, but it also helps drop the center of gravity down versus the regular 5 Series. This is one of the ways that BMW has managed to make an all-wheel drive next generation vehicle with more luxury gadgets and goodies on the inside actually lighter than the previous generation rear-wheel drive vehicle. Front seat comfort is excellent in the model that we're driving. Of course, you'd expect that with a price tag that's about $130,000 as we're driving it right here. We have the BMW multi-contour seats, which means that we get 4-way adjustable lumbar support, a power extending thigh cushion, adjustable seat back articulation, power headrests, and inflatable side bolsters via a little switch on the seat right there. We also get a powered tilt telescopic steering column. It is heated. We also get seat massage, 2-position memory over there on the doors, and the passenger seat has the exact same range of motion as the driver's seat, including the available massage functionality. Sitting right here behind myself, I have a few inches of legroom left, although I do tend to sit in a little bit more upright position than some folks do. Headroom is fairly generous back here. I still have about an inch of headroom left. We don't have a moonroof here. If I move over to the middle seat, I still have just about enough headroom to do this if I needed to go out to lunch, but my head is touching the ceiling because this seating position is higher off the ground than the outboard seats. If I scoot over to the right side of the vehicle, the shorter dimensions internally versus some of the competition, you'll see those on your chart, is noticeable. The footroom is definitely a little bit compromised, and I have only about half an inch of legroom left. This front seat is all the way back in its tracks. I had a 6'5" person sitting up front. The rear seats get a fold down center armrest with 2 cup holders right inside, and in a very practical touch that we see in a lot of European sedans, but less frequently in sedans from other places, we have a 40-20-40 folding rear seat back. This is a lot more practical than a ski pass-through because you can put larger items right here into the cabin. Even though BMW was obviously interested in structural rigidity with the M5 and absolute performance, they're still giving us a complete trunk pass-through. So all sides of this rear seat back do fold down, and it makes this a lot more practical than some sedans out there. Behind the trunk lid, we find the same 18.7 cubic feet of cargo capacity that we find in the regular 5 Series sedan. That means that our overall 24-inch bag score remains the same at 5. This is one of the larger and deeper and actually squarer trunks available in this segment. So you're going to be a little bit more able to put bags in here than something like a Mercedes-Benz E-Class or a Lexus GS. The average trunk size in this category is right around 15 to 16 cubic feet. So this is definitely a little bit larger. Of course, one of the ways that we get to this large trunk is by the fact that we have no spare tire. In fact, there's nothing under this floor in the trunk. It's just a floor. We're going to take a very, very brief spin around the interior. If you want to know more about this interior, it's basically the same as some of the other BMW 5 Series reviews on our channel. Again, no sunroof up here, although we do have a very nicely done Alcantara headliner. If we move over to there to the back, you can see those built-in sunshades. We have fixed height shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger. I do think that's a little bit unusual, actually. And then the headrests are this very interesting and eccentric shape. They're powered, they move up and down. And at the front of the headrest area, they have a BMW M5 logo right there in the back. It's a 2-tone seat with a center black section perforated because these seats are ventilated, and then a brown outside in this particular model. You can really see the very aggressive bolstering on the seat side cushion and the seat bottom cushion right there. You can also see that extending thigh cushion on the bottom of the seat. As you'd expect out of a vehicle with a large price tag, the front doors are made from either soft touch plastics or a lot of stitched leather. So you can see all that leather going on right there on the door middle section. We also find leather at the top part of the door, so this upper section right there is also a stitched leather component. We then find some very interestingly designed trim right there rather than real wood. And then moving on up, you can see that we have illuminated speaker grills. The glove box is a bin style compartment. I was just barely able to fit a larger tablet computer inside. In the middle of the dash, we find the latest BMW iDrive system. This is characterized by now having a touchscreen as well as wireless Apple CarPlay integration. The only thing really unique to the M car is this M setup, where we can actually control the way that 2 shortcut buttons on the steering wheel work. You can choose your transmission shift behavior, D3, S1, S2, etc. right there in that mode. The steering, the chassis, the engine, the all-wheel drive system. If you'd like the vehicle to be in rear-wheel drive, here's how you do it. We scroll this to DSC off, change this one to the two-wheel drive mode, and bang, you have a car that can do burnouts. You can also choose the way the engine is going to operate: efficient, sport, sport plus, and you can have things like engine in sport plus, the suspension in comfort if you want to, the transmission in D3 rather than S3, and you can choose the view of the heads-up display. Working our way down from there, we have two large air vents, hazard light button. This button allows you to turn on, off, or set the safety systems to an individual mode. We then have some buttons for the infotainment system right here. These are favorite buttons, 1 through 7. There's a button right over there to take you to the connected drive functionality in iDrive. Power volume knob over there, track forward, backward, and eject button for this single slot optical disc player. And then we have the controls for the front 2 zones of the 4-zone automatic climate control system. Working our way down from there, we have a wireless charging slot. That's where I have my iPhone currently stuck in there. You notice it's not connected via a cable to the system, but we were still able to use Apple CarPlay, and that's because this does have one of the only wireless CarPlay systems. The 2 cup holders in there, and we can slide that lid closed. Moving back from there, we find a very different shifter than we find in the rest of the BMW lineup in America. BMW has been long known for their joystick style shifters, but this one operates a little bit differently. So drive is over there to the right like that, and if you want the sport mode, we click it once more over there to that side. Manual mode happens by just toggling it up and down. If you want reverse, then it's over to the left, and then forward, and then the stick does not return to the joystick center. It actually stays there in reverse mode. If we simply pull it back, it goes to neutral. We then have to toggle it back over for drive or for sport. If you want to park the vehicle, the parking button is right there. To the left of the shifter, we have a button to turn on and off the traction and stability control. We have 2 different levels of off. We have sort of a reduced mode, and then we have absolutely crazy, completely off. Then we have buttons to control the various adjustable features in the vehicle. So this button right here controls the way the drivetrain works. So we have efficient, sport, sport plus. This one in the middle controls the suspension, and that allows us to choose between harder and softer. And then we have a steering wheel button that allows us to change the way the steering behaves in the system. We can choose between comfort, sport, and sport plus. If you click the setup button, that takes you to the menu in the iDrive system where you can actually adjust those settings. The instrument cluster is a full LCD unit, very much like we see in other BMW models. We have physical rings that are sort of glued onto the front of the LCD. I think this does make the LCD a little bit more difficult to clean in daily life. So a physical element right here, and then over here for the fuel gauge, and then basically the same thing over there on the right side of that instrument cluster. This instrument cluster gives you a little bit more information than we see in some of the non-M5 series models, but it's not quite as snazzy as some of the competition's displays. So you will never see a moving map display in this LCD. Moving out from there, we find the latest BMW M steering wheel. Nothing gimmicky going on here, so we don't have a flat bottom on the steering wheel, and we have sport grips that are not quite as exaggerated as some wheels up here on the top. We have paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel. We have down on the left and up over there on the right, but they're not some of those enormous and gorgeous paddle shifters that we find in something like an Alfa Romeo. These are just a little bit more discreet, a little bit more luxury car standard. We have those shortcut buttons for the various M modes over here, M1 and M2 over there on that side, heated steering wheel button on the bottom, leather airbag cover, the controls for our radar adaptive cruise control system over here on the left, along with that steering button, and then over here on the right we have the controls for the infotainment system, volume up, down, and then this scroll allows you to scroll through the various tracks. We have a mode button, and then a dedicated phone button and voice command button. Since the M5 is all about performance, let's talk about that up front. 0 to 60 happens in a very astonishing 2.8 seconds. That's significantly faster than BMW claims the M5 will go. And that's not too surprising, of course, because BMW continually underrates their engines. This is probably making more than 600 horsepower. Everybody seems to know that, really. But what is surprising really is the delta between the claimed 0 to 60 time and the actual 0 to 60 time. It is a little bit larger than I had expected. As we see with some other BMW products, if you don't use launch control, then the 0 to 60 time is just about where BMW says it should be. So without launch control, this was about 3 to 3.1 seconds, depending on what mode that we were in. And if you do use launch control, 2.8 seconds, time after time after time. This has significantly larger turbochargers than the M550i's engine, and we get a great deal more boost. There's so much boost happening with this engine that at altitude, 0 to 60 doesn't really seem to drop too much, because when we had this up in Portland, Oregon very recently, we were pulling 2.9 seconds 0 to 60 at 1,400 feet with an extra 200-pound camera guy in the car. That is an absolutely incredible 0 to 60 score, and it would simply not be possible without the all-wheel drive system that we find in the M5. I know that a lot of people are really upset about the all-wheel drive system in this M. They say that it's not a true M car because it has four-wheel motivation. I just think that's nonsense, because if you want the fastest vehicle in this segment, if you want to go really fast in your four-door sedan, you really do need all-wheel drive. It's really obvious when you take a look at 0 to 60 times, with which you could, I suppose, compare the M5. For instance, if you took a look at a 797 horsepower Dodge Challenger, very different kind of vehicle, but similar price point, way more power than we find in this car, actually slower 0 to 60. A McLaren 720S, about the same speed 0 to 60, because even though that vehicle has over 700 horsepower, it's two-wheel drive and it simply can't apply it like the M5 can. And if you were to put this in rear-wheel drive mode, which is still an option as I said before, it's actually going to go slower 0 to 60. And it's also going to be a hell of a lot more to deal with because the rear end is going to get very, very lively. Now, BMW tells us that they have deliberately programmed this all-wheel drive system to never send 50% of engine power up front, even though it's mechanically possible. They've decided to keep this a very strongly biased rear-wheel drive system. However, it is still very helpful when you're out on a winding mountain road like this, because you can really feel the all-wheel drive system helping you around the corners. As we wait at this very inconveniently located stoplight, let's talk about braking times, because those are nothing short of amazing as well. This vehicle stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 95 feet. That is an incredibly short distance. And the only vehicles that we've ever had that have come even close to that overall stopping distance have been things like the Cadillac CTS-V, also an incredible stopping distance, high-performance versions of the Camaro, the Corvette, etc. Those are really the only things that are going to get anywhere close to this. Even our recent experience in a McLaren 720S, it was not able to stop as short as the M5, likely because of the overall weight balance, and arguably possibly because the vehicle is not as heavy as the M5. What makes that stopping distance perhaps more impressive are the tires that are on this vehicle, because we have 275 with tires up front, which are not the widest front tire you can find out there. Some vehicles have 305 with tires, and they won't stop as short as this. And out back we have 285 with tires. This vehicle has a staggered tire setup, but it's not as staggered as some vehicles out there, for lack of a better term. So a lot of vehicles out there may have 255s up front, 300s out back, something along those lines. Front and rear tire sizes are a lot more close together in this generation of the M5, likely because of the all-wheel drive system and BMW's desire to make the M5 very well balanced overall. When it comes to overall handling, the M5 is absolutely incredible, but some people may be offended by the sort of robotic or video game-like quality we find in this vehicle. Grip limits are so high, and of course we have electric power steering in this vehicle, that it is a little bit difficult to tell exactly what all four tires on the car are doing. Now, some people may be offended by that, but I just tend to think that this is just the unfortunate side effect of modernity and the progression towards better fuel economy, because even in a vehicle like the M5, fuel economy has to be a consideration, and that's why we find the electric power steering system. Electric power steering definitely saps some of the fun out of the car. I've had SUVs that had better steering feel than this M5 or any modern performance vehicle, and that's just a fact of life in the 21st century. As sad as that may be, I can't really blame BMW for that, because everybody has to go in this particular generation. Now, as far as electric power steering systems go, this is very quick, it's accurate, and we do get a hint of steering feedback from the front tires, but again, not as much as previous generations of the M5, quite logically. When it comes to our overall handling score, clearly this has to get an A+. The M5 is well balanced, as is obvious by not just the weight distribution, but just the overall design of the vehicle. BMW has really managed to thread the needle when it comes to handling precision, the overall ride quality of the vehicle, the tire sizes involved, the overall braking performance, etc. Now keep in mind the model that we are driving does have the optional carbon ceramic brakes. I should have mentioned that a little bit earlier, and that logically is why we have that really short braking distance up top. If you didn't get the carbon ceramic brake package, that's likely going to be a little bit longer. Out on rougher roads like this, it's obvious that the M5 is the most performance-oriented version of the 5 Series, but this is still a luxury car, so the suspension is actually a little bit softer than some high-performance vehicles out there. So this is definitely more comfortable and more livable than a supercar, with which this actually shares an awful lot of characteristics in terms of overall performance. Overall suspension tune is going to be a little bit more comfortable, obviously, in the M550i, but because this has an adaptive suspension system, in comfort mode, it actually gets almost almost as comfortable as that next step down in terms of 5 Series performance. So this is still a very comfortable, livable vehicle. But again, that goes to the core mission of the M5. So this is the kind of vehicle that you could take clients out to lunch in. They're not going to toss their cookies in the back seat. They're not going to knock their teeth out when this vehicle is in comfort mode. But if you wanted to impress them a little bit, you could firm things up and definitely still go 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. In our cabin noise test, we scored 71 decibels in this cabin. That's quite logically louder than the M550 or the M530 because we get wider tires on this car. We also get a little bit more digital exhaust noise in the cabin and a little bit more real exhaust noise as well. The M5 has an incredible exhaust note, whether we're flooring it without this exhaust button engaged or whether we engage that and floor it again. But as I said before, not all of the engine noise you're getting in this cabin is real. Some of it has been digitally manipulated. That's something that we've seen out of BMW for a while. It's a very well done digital soundtrack, and unless you knew about it, you're really not going to be able to tell the difference, and it's still going to impress your passengers. But there is a little bit of me that feels cheated every time I get into a vehicle with a digital soundtrack. I'd rather it was just real noise coming into the cabin. Now, not as cheated as in a Ford F-150 pickup truck, which plays a V8 soundtrack on top of a V6 engine. These engine noises are a little bit more in keeping with what's going on under the hood, but again, not all of them are real. When it comes to our fuel economy score, I'm going to have to give this a C-. Now, the M5 is theoretically very efficient for the kind of power that we're getting out of this vehicle. Fuel economy is better than something like a Hellcat or a Challenger Hellcat or the Demon or something along those lines. Definitely more fuel efficient than something like a Jeep Trackhawk, which gets shockingly similar 0 to 60 and performance times as this vehicle. But overall, this is obviously going to be the least efficient version of the 5 Series. And if you're really driving this car hard, you're going to be getting around 13.5 miles per gallon, which is what we've been averaging. Now, if you can keep your foot off the throttle pedal and really treat it gently on a longer highway trip, you can get fuel economy that approaches 30 miles per gallon. So in that respect, it is still relatively efficient. And that is what we expect out of a modern BMW turbocharged engine. My bottom line with the M5 is that there are certainly people out there that are going to be offended by the modern technology that we find in this new M5. The all-wheel drive system, the turbocharged engine, the traditional automatic transmission that is absolutely silky smooth compared to the dual clutch transmissions that we've found in M5s before, or the traditional automatic with a torque converter delete that we find in the Mercedes AMG product line. That's not a very smooth transmission in that Mercedes model, whereas this does low speed stop and go traffic very, very smoothly. It climbs hills perfectly, just like you'd expect out of a luxury car. But the trade-off for this is absolutely blistering performance. 0 to 60 again in 2.8 seconds. The quarter mile happens at 130 miles an hour. Again, these are performance specifications that you would expect out of a supercar, a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, a McLaren 720. The McLaren 720 is an interesting comparison because I was able to drive it back to back with this M5, and in some performance situations, this actually beat the McLaren 720, and this is about 1/3 the price, and it's a 4-door, 5-seat family sedan. Although you will likely still find some 2018 M5s hanging out on dealer lots, in terms of pricing, we're talking about the 2019 model year. The M5 starts at $102,700, and if you want the competition package model, then that's $110,000. That's a pretty significant bump over the M550i, but you do get some pretty big changes. We get a tweaked engine with larger turbochargers, a 500 RPM higher redline, increased cooling ability, the larger diameter exhaust system, basically the same 8-speed automatic transmission, but it's been significantly reprogrammed versus what we see in the M550i. It has a more aggressive torque converter lockup, it's programmed for faster and more aggressive shifts as well. Oddly enough, we don't have the active roll stabilization that we find available in the M550i and no rear wheel steering. BMW tells us that it wasn't needed in the M5 and they didn't like the way it made the M5 feel overall, so they left it just down there in the M550i. We have that carbon fiber roof, but of course you can opt to get the moonroof if you want. So you can delete the carbon fiber roof, have a regular roof and a moonroof there, but obviously that won't give you the same benefit as that carbon fiber model. There are also some pretty big power steering tweaks, some tweaks to the suspension. Overall, we have M-specific designs up front and in the rear. They're based on the main M5 model's suspension, but they have been adjusted for the M5. We have upgraded brakes, obviously those optional carbon ceramic brakes that our particular model had, the torque vectoring rear differential, the all-wheel drive disable mode, which you won't find in the other versions of the 5 Series with all-wheel drive, the lower final drive ratio on the axles, and of course those interior tweaks and the 275 with front tires. The M5 that we were driving in this video had a ton of options on it, and it ended up right around $130,000 total. When it comes to competition, it is a little bit tricky. I would say this is really a two-person race between the E-Class and the 5 Series, or you could widen out to being a three-man race and include the Cadillac CTS-V. That's because we don't find an RS6 in America, and even if there were, it wouldn't necessarily be in the same league here either, because the RS7, which we do get in the US, is about a second lower. But it's not a sedan, it's a liftback. Therefore, logically, our first competitor is the Mercedes-Benz E63S. 603 horsepower, a whopping 627 pound-feet of torque, and a 9-speed automatic transmission help that vehicle go from 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds. That is also faster than the manufacturer estimate of 3.3, quite logically, because if BMW is going to go faster than their estimate, why shouldn't Mercedes? The Mercedes E-Class AMG really is one of the big reasons that we have an all-wheel drive M5, because Mercedes has been putting all-wheel drive on their E-Class AMG for a while, and that is one of the ways that Mercedes has really gotten to those excellent, really fast 0 to 60 numbers. Now on the downside, Mercedes also takes out the torque converter on their transmission and inserts a clutch pack instead, and the clutch is just not as smooth. E-Class AMGs tend to be a little bit herky-jerky. It's really noticeable in slow-and-go or stop-and-go traffic where they just don't feel like a traditional automatic. The dual-clutch transmissions that we saw in previous generations of M products was smoother than what we saw in Mercedes models, and now the M product line is even smoother because we have real automatic transmissions. And while some people may bemoan that and the fact that it doesn't feel quite as engaging as a DCT, I actually really appreciate the fact that we get the performance, but we also get that smooth driving nature. The E-Class feels a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier, and that's a little logical because it is heavier than the M5, but 0 to 60 performance is nearly identical thanks to all of that extra power. It's also worth noting that Mercedes just chooses to tune the E-Class a little bit differently, because it's not as much heavier than the M5 as the overall feel out on the road would indicate. But Mercedes does use a very different suspension design in the E-Class. It actually has a variant of their air ride suspension. And that helps the E-Class have a very firm ride when it wants to, but also a more supple ride than the M5 when it wants to as well. We also have a glorious exhaust note from the E-Class. I'm really torn as to whether I like the E-Class AMG a bit more or the M5 a bit more, because there are aspects of the Mercedes that I really like. I love the suspension tune, I love the exhaust note, but the transmission is not exactly my favorite. I also have to say on the positive side that the Mercedes has a really excellently done interior. I love the new design on the E-Class. I also see that on the CLS as well. And the large infotainment screen definitely is a little bit more impressive than what we find in the 5 Series. But on the flip side, the 5 Series is such a well-rounded car. And I'm not just talking about handling ability, just the entire way the vehicle is put together. Instead of a vehicle with highs and lows, like we see even in the E-Class AMG, everything is just done to a very well-rounded, very uniform level in the 5 Series. And that's one thing that I've really appreciated. Moving on over to the Cadillac CTS-V, we see more of those highs and lows. The lack of all-wheel drive means that it's about as fast 0 to 60 as the RS7, even though we actually get more power than the Mercedes or the BMW. Just can't apply that power as well. In addition to that, the interior is also a set of highs and lows because it feels well put together in base format for the base CTS, but by the time you've worked your way on up to the CTS-V and started adding options, the interior doesn't feel like it really belongs in this segment as well as the BMW or the Mercedes. The CTS has excellent handling dynamics for sure. In fact, I actually think that the steering and the overall handling feel of the CTS-V is superior to the M5 and the Mercedes E63, and I would say that it has been ever since the CTS-V was created. Cadillac really has an incredible dedication to handling ability and handling feel in their vehicles. But on the downside, the Cadillac is a little bit more cramped inside. Again, it's a vehicle full of highs and lows. The trunk isn't quite as practical, and some people may find the overall styling to be a little bit brash, although I actually think that's a benefit on the side of the CTS because I do like the style going on there. Bottom lining this segment is a little bit tricky. I had initially thought that I would put the CTS-V last in this segment, but the more that I really thought about it and being able to drive vehicles from dealers back to back, the more I really thought that they're almost equal in some ways, but they appeal to different parts of my personality. I love the styling of the CTS-V, and I especially love its lower price tag because it is significantly less expensive than the Mercedes or the BMW, and you all know that I love value here. I also like the way that the CTS-V is styled. It's brash, but I actually like that about the Cadillac. The Mercedes has an excellent ride, and I really love the way that V8 sounds. If you're simply shopping for V8 sound, the Mercedes would be the way to go in my mind. It also is practical in that it gets better fuel economy than the M5, definitely better fuel economy than the CTS-V, and it's comfortable. It's just a very, very comfortable, well-rounded performance vehicle. But then we have that transmission, which is not as smooth. And then on the M5, we have absolutely blistering performance, but it feels a little bit robotic, a little bit more isolated, especially than the CTS-V. But the M5 also feels, because of its well-rounded nature, that it has perhaps a little bit less personality than the Mercedes. Which one I would buy ends up being really tricky as a result, because I like aspects of the Mercedes, but the transmission is a big problem for me. I like aspects of the BMW, but the more exciting, more engaging feel that we find in the CTS is attractive, and the more personality that we see in the Mercedes is also attractive. So instead of giving a top pick here, I would instead ask you which of these three would you get, and why would you do that? Let me know down there in the comments section below. Are you as conflicted as I am? Would you get all three if you had the cash? And more interestingly than that, I would actually say is if you had the cash to buy just two of them, which two would you get? I suspect that if that was my choice, then I would get the Mercedes and the BMW because I like enough aspects of both of them and the performance that I would get those two, and I would leave the Cadillac CTS-V as the second place option in that pairing. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Click on those related videos that you'll see on your screen. If you want to support this channel, and I hope you do, click up there to the top of your screen. You'll be taken over to patreon.com, and you can do a monthly pledge to help support Alex on Autos. We really thank all of our Patreon sponsors because that does help keep Alex on Autos on the airwaves or on the YouTube waves or whatever you want to call us. I'll see you next week.